So good morning, everyone. Thank you to the forum for inviting me. I'm trying very hard not to be intimidated by my august panel members who have, all of their work has inspired me over the years. I'm really going to build on what Christina was talking about in a slightly different way. So I'm coming to this from the point of view of an anthropologist, but you'll see that the core concepts are very similar. So as we all know here, the causes of violence are very complex. But there's increasing agreement that they're related to power, the normative use of violence, and the meaning of being a man or a woman in a particular society. So the work that or the thoughts that I'm going to share today come from almost 6 years of experience in northern Uganda, addressing violence among children, adolescents, and youth. The two projects, they're both USAID-funded projects that I'll be drawing from, are the REAL project, which was a fatherhood mentoring program designed to reduce the incidence of intimate partner violence and harsh physical discipline by promoting positive parenting factors among young men. The GREAT project was seeks to prevent violence and improve sexual and reproductive health among adolescents, also in northern Uganda. And they were both founded or based on formative research, which really revealed the powerful influence of social norms, especially those related to gender. So this is a little bit of my outline for this morning. So I'll share a little bit of our guiding principles or perspectives to this work. You know, why some social norms are acceptable and some violence is acceptable sometimes and not others. You know, how people learn to be violent, and a little bit of what we've done to take action based on this understanding. So family violence is a global phenomenon, but the forms that it takes varies widely, depending on the local systems of meaning, the broader context of power and macro-level influences on a community or individuals. So we know that, someone mentioned this already, people behave in ways that make sense to them. So we need to understand the system and how it influences their behavior. That will really give us a better base to take action to address violence. So I'm going to start with a story because stories are the coin of trade of anthropologists, and I have the whole story here out on the table. I can only share a couple of excerpts with you. So this is the story of Falal, who's 16 years old. And it's very interesting if you read it to see all of the different factors, normative factors that are at play in her story. But she becomes pregnant from a rape, which is engineered from her boyfriend and his friends. And her father rejects her. She moves in with the father of the baby, whose name is Okello. So she says, "For the short time we spent together, he did not see me as a woman. He thought I played tricks on him. He admitted that he thought I was smarter than him. He once explained to me that he treats me poorly as a way to ensure that I respect him. He denied the rape, and he called me complicated." She goes back to Gulu. She moves in with his family. But then his uncle begins to sexually harass her because her boyfriend is no longer visiting her, and she decides she has to go back home. So again, I had no choice but to return home to my village and beg my father to take my daughter and me in. I admitted fault, but he insisted that it was Okello's responsibility to care for me. I was no longer his property. So Falal's story shows us that the understanding of the meaning of specific acts of violence really requires a holistic view of the ways that power are played out in our lives. Cultural meanings, including social norms, are learned, shared ways of thinking and behaving that people have because they were born into a particular society in a particular place at a particular time. The good news, of course, is that culture is dynamic and mutable. If we learn how to be violent, we can also learn how not to be violent. Social norms as we've already discussed, determine what's acceptable and what is not. For example, the fine line between abuse and discipline. You know, this does change over time, and we've seen that, in our communities. This transformation can be facilitated by culturally informed, well-designed intervention efforts. So let's take a look at why some social norms are seen as legitimate, but others are not. So the research and the findings I'm sharing today come from rapid ethnographic approaches that have been developed by applied anthropologists over the last 2 decades, really based on mixed methods, a mix of insider and outsider perspectives, and an iterative data collection process. So we learned that there are multiple ways of performing masculine and feminine roles in Acholi and Lango communities, which is where we're doing this work. Yet conventional gender norms that mandate power and control over women, exactly the way Christina was explaining, really are dominant. So according to tradition, a wife is always subservient to her husband, even if he has done something wrong or has been unfaithful. Gender norms such as this are closely linked to domestic violence and intimate partner violence. So in this quote that I'm going to read, we gave young people toy animals, and they were asked to select an animal and talk that represented for them an ideal or typical woman or man. So in this case, we could see that the resulting discussions really showed how closely gender and violence is linked. I have selected a cow for an ideal woman because a cow is used by human beings. It cannot do anything until its owner says so, just like a woman who waits for information from her husband. In a home, sometimes there's a misunderstanding, and just like a cow is beaten when it fails to do the task so is a woman beaten by her husband. So from the life histories we conducted with boys and girls, we learned that they view the world as a dangerous place. Multiple forms of violence around them, verbal, emotional, physical, and sexual. The types of violence that they described fell on a continuum from insulting and shouting to coerced sex and rape, witchcraft, a number of different forms of violence. When we asked them to rank what forms of violence from least to most acceptable, intimate partner violence was considered the most common and worrisome, but not always unacceptable. So in fact, the only form of violence that was widely accepted in these communities was violence which was linked to gender norms. That is, beating wives or children in a controlled or proper manner to teach, discipline, or punish. And this is a little excerpt from an interview with a woman who says it's okay if a man beats you if it's done in a good way, if it's done to discipline you, and if it's done in a way that doesn't hurt you too much. So you're not supposed to beat on the face, for example. So thus, in these communities, as in most places, I think, around the world, doing violence is a way of doing gender. It's a performance of gender identities that they often depend on acquiescing to violence or being violent. So a man may beat his wife to show to other men that he has control. At the same time, a woman may acquiesce or accept the beating because she wants to demonstrate her role as a competent wife. So on this slide, we see some of the norms that are related to gender-based violence that we identified during our research. They fall into the gender roles bucket, general ideas about violence, and broader social norms around social relationships. So as children grow up, they learn social expectations related to gender and violence. This table shows the enculturation processes which unfold within the context of the social systems which surround young people. For example, the family, the workplace, the place of worship, and school are all gendered institutions which reproduce inequalities between women and men. So in the following slide, we'll just look at a few of the processes that enculturate new members of society into norms. So when young people were asked how they learned to be men and women, their most common response was by observing their parents, their peers, others in their community. Many study participants commented on the power of the example. So this woman, I see my children will learn this behavior thinking it is good for people to do that. She's referring to her husband's abusive behavior. Sometimes I hear them imitating their father, how he staggers home, how he hits me. But if they will ask me if that is bad, why is Baba doing it? And she goes on to talk about her dilemma in raising her children. So peers, of course, provide advice, they model behaviors, and they're very important enforcers of social norms. So this is a story from a newly married young woman who arrives in a new village, a new compound, and is very happy because the women in her family welcome her and teach her how to be a good wife. And you can see by the quote, they're basically telling her that she must obey her husband without question, or there'll be problems and violence will ensue. So violence is also sometimes used, as I mentioned before, to enforce gender norms and roles. This was a 27-year-old community leader who was very well respected, and he talked about that he once slapped his wife because she didn't have the food ready, but it was effective. The next day, the problem was resolved. The final thing I want to talk about in terms of acculturation is political and historical influences. So just one of them I'm going to mention is the patrilineal kinship structure of these communities. Many boys and girls talked about the fact that the girls move and join their husband's family was a way that they were devalued in the household, as you see this quote from this young woman. So understanding the meanings of violence and how people learn gender helped us to design the two interventions that I mentioned early on, Great and Real. So don't be overwhelmed by the slide. I just want to talk about one element of it. This is our model for transforming social norms. And if you look at the blue box on your left, it really represents some of the interventions which the literature, much of it from Christina, talks that can influence norms, things like mentoring, discussion, deliberate diffusion. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those mechanisms and how we can use them to address violence. So positive modeling and mentoring. Of course, the REAL program is based on mentoring young fathers. So this is a quote from a young man who really appreciates his mentor. My mentor has helped me make important life-changing decisions. When someone uses their personal experience and training to mentor you, it is a big gift. Diffusing discussion. So another critical way of challenging and changing those normative expectations. So REAL uses 6 large posters which are sequentially unveiled during community meetings. And the point of them is to diffuse reflection on social norms related to fatherhood and violence. Another important mechanism is collective change, public pledges, so kind of understanding what people really do think and think I should do. So the REAL intervention cycle ends with a community celebration which features testimonies from fathers and wives, support from the community for the change they're seeing, and public change pledges for the community to commit to nonviolence. So turning to REAL for a moment, we have a very good example of mass media and advocacy, another one of those important mechanisms that we use to shift social norms. So the core element of GREAT was a 52-session serial radio drama following 4 fictional characters, transitional characters, in a fictional village of Oteka, which means great or gender equitable. So this young man says, I heard it on Radio Mega. Nowadays, Uganda is a country in which women can also do things that men can do. My interest is that the government should continue so that women can have the same rights as men. One last example from GREAT, discussion and deliberation. Both of these interventions are very much focused on engaging people to reflect and discuss social norms. And this one, the GREAT is engaging parents and elders in dialogue and reflection through the tradition of the Wango, or the evening bonfire, where the elders pass on cultural norms. So both of these projects were successful in reducing family violence. I don't have time to share all the results with you, but I can say that in the case of GREAT, we see significantly less tolerance of violence, nonviolent management of conflict, and decreased sexual harassment. And for REAL, which was tested using a randomized control trial, this is data just from last week, hot off the press. We see immediate and sustained results in violence attitudes and behaviors. So 3 months after the intervention and 1 year later. So just to close up, a few closing remarks. The experience of these 2 projects in northern Uganda suggests that holistic interventions that reach boys and girls at an early age and at critical life transitions, like new fathers, newly married couples, puberty, those that harness acculturation processes and also address the adults in their lives, are effective ways to prevent gender-based violence. Structural forces also constrain efforts and need to be addressed as well, although I haven't done that at all or successfully. So given the hidden influence of social norms and the power of sanctions to enforce gender role transgressions, we really need to encourage youth and other community members to reflect critically on the influence of these social norms in their lives, and encourage youth to advocate for themselves, strengthening their ability to change and to resist the paths that are imposed upon them as a member of a particular community and culture.